Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating historical and textual investigation based on our source material. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're essentially stepping into the shoes of historical detectives. We're going to examine a really ancient text that has literally been the center of intense theological debate for centuries, Isaiah 42. By looking entirely through the lens of the detailed analysis provided in our source, we're going to closely examine the language, the precise geography, and the deep history surrounding this very specific biblical prophecy. So here is our docket of evidence for today. We'll be covering the mystery of Isaiah 42, manuscripts and the missing word, a law for the nations, geography regarding Kedar and Mount Sela, attributes of a man of war, and finally, the linguistic secret of Meshullam. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The Mystery of Isaiah 42. Two faiths, one ancient text. Now, for centuries, the 42nd chapter of the book of Isaiah has basically been claimed by two major world religions. Traditionally, Christian scholars view this chapter as a definitive, clear-cut prophecy about Jesus. But on the flip side, early Islamic scholars, going all the way back to the very first century of Islam, argued that it actually points directly to the Prophet Muhammad. So what happens when we peel back the layers of centuries of translation? Well, the source argues that by reading the original Hebrew texts, literally getting down to the actual strokes of the letters, some incredibly startling details emerge that really challenge the traditional narrative.
Moving on to Section 2, Manuscripts and the Missing Word, Tracing the Strokes of Hebrew Letters. To build this case, our source grounds us in a really strict timeline of the manuscripts themselves. We start way back with the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, which date to the 1st century BCE. Then we jump forward to the 7th century CE with historical accounts from early Islamic scholars. And finally, we land in the 10th century CE. You might be wondering, why is that last date so important? Well, because the 10th century is when the Masoretic text, which is the standardized Hebrew text that forms the basis of our modern Old Testament, was actually compiled and finalized. That means the standard text we use today was locked in place centuries after the dawn of Islam. Now let's talk about the ancient scripts, because this is where it gets really visually fascinating. In the standard Hebrew text today, Isaiah 42:1 reads, "Behold my servant whom I uphold." And the Hebrew word used there for uphold is etmach. But notice the striking visual similarity the source points out here. If you compare the Hebrew letters for etmach to the Arabic word amud, which is one of the names of the Prophet Muhammad, the actual shapes of the letters are remarkably close. The source argues that the Hebrew letters for T and H, as well as K and D, were nearly indistinguishable in ancient unpointed scripts. This suggests a very real possibility of textual alteration over time, whether that was intentional or totally accidental. And to back this up, the source presents some heavy historical testimony. This is a quote from Ka'b el-Ahbar. He was a prominent 7th century Jewish rabbi who ended up converting to Islam. According to the historical records we have, when Ka'b quoted this exact verse from the Torah scrolls that were available to him back then, he didn't say whom I uphold. He explicitly used the name Ahmad. He quoted it as, "Ahmad, my chosen servant, neither harsh nor fierce." This strongly suggests that back in the 7th century, there were variations of the manuscript that explicitly contained this name. The plot definitely thickens when we look at how this exact same verse has been recorded across entirely different historical sources. Like we said, the 10th century Masoretic text says uphold. But if you look at the Christian Gospel of Matthew chapter 12, which quotes this very verse, it uses the phrase my beloved. And then a 14th century Jewish convert to Islam named Abd al-Haq al-Maghribi cited Hebrew manuscripts that read his name in that exact spot. So the source argues that all these historical discrepancies across different manuscripts prove there's a deep, deep instability in the text. It implies the original word was likely lost, altered, or perhaps even concealed as the centuries rolled by. All right, Section 3, a law for the nations, unpacking the word mishpat. Let's dig into the mission of this prophesied figure. The text of Isaiah 42 explicitly states that this chosen servant will bring justice to the goyim, which is the Hebrew word for the Gentile nations, or basically the non-Israelites. The source contrasts this directly with the biblical account of Jesus. Specifically, in Matthew 15, Jesus states quite clearly, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." The source uses this to argue that because Isaiah 42 describes a figure sent explicitly to the wider Gentile nations, it fundamentally contrasts with the biblical parameters of Jesus' specific mission. Furthermore, we have to ask, what exactly is the servant bringing to the nations? The Hebrew word used in the text is mishpat.
Now, while that's often translated simply as justice, the source points to leading academic biblical commentaries like Keel and Delitzsch to dig deeper. They define mishpat not just as some sort of moral or spiritual advice, but as a total, comprehensive, legal and civic framework that governs political and social relations. The source argues that Jesus explicitly stated his kingdom was not of this world, and he didn't bring a civic legal code. Whereas, the Prophet Muhammad brought a complete practical legal system which aligns perfectly with that academic definition of mishpat. This distinction is absolutely crucial to the source's argument because it shifts the whole prophecy from a purely spiritual mission to a distinctly civic one.
Which brings us to Section 4, Geography, Kedar and Mount Sela, pinpointing the exact location. So this is where the text moves from general descriptions to amazingly precise geography. Verse 11 of Isaiah 42 gets incredibly specific. It calls on the settlements where Kedar lives to rejoice, and for the people of Sela to sing from the mountaintops. Well, who is Kedar? If you look at biblical dictionaries and historical records, they identify Kedar as the second son of Ishmael. He's inextricably linked to the Arabs, and specifically to the Quraysh tribe in the Hijaz region. And Mount Sela? The source points out that Sela is a famous, heavily documented mountain located strictly in the city of Medina. In fact, it sits just about 500 meters away from the Prophet Muhammad's mosque. And this geographical pinpointing brings us to a really fascinating historical anecdote. According to our source, these exact geographical clues, Kedar and Sela, are the specific reasons why ancient Jewish tribes migrated to and settled in the Arabian city of Medina in the first place. Historical accounts suggest they were literally waiting there for a prophesied leader to emerge in that exact precise geographical location. Moving to Section 5, Attributes of a Man of War, the champion of verse 13. Let's look at verse 13 of Isaiah 42. It describes the servant stepping forth like a mighty man of war, a warrior who shouts aloud and absolutely prevails over his enemies. The source asks us to look at this impartially. The Christian tradition overwhelmingly describes Jesus as a peaceful figure, someone who submitted to crucifixion and definitely did not fight physical worldly battles. In contrast, the source argues that these victorious, highly military characteristics, this prevailing over physical enemies, directly matches the historical life and the actual military campaigns of the Prophet Muhammad. And finally, Section 6, the linguistic secret of Meshalem, the servant of verse 19. All right, this brings us to the final piece of the linguistic puzzle. Down in verse 19, the servant is given a very specific title, Meshalem. The source directs us to the Gesenius lexicon, which is pretty much one of the most respected academic dictionaries for biblical Hebrew out there. The Hebrew root for Meshalem is Shin Lam Mem. Now, in Semitic languages, the Hebrew Shin directly corresponds to the Arabic Sin. So Shin Lam Mem is the exact literal equivalent of the Arabic root SLM. The lexicon explicitly notes that this root means submission to God, which you might recognize is the literal translation of the word Islam. And a Muslim is simply one who submits. The source makes the bold argument that the ancient text is, quite literally, calling the servant a Muslim. So, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've journeyed through manuscript discrepancies, deep linguistic roots, precise geography, and totally fascinating historical context, all derived from our source's intense study of Isaiah 42. And it really leaves us with a profound question to ponder. How much of history's truth is just hidden within the subtle strokes of ancient letters, waiting to be deciphered? It just goes to show us that when we look really closely at the architecture of ancient texts, the history we thought was completely settled can suddenly open up into fascinating new mysteries. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and always keep questioning what you see on the page.